everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We will begin in a moment here. Just want to let everyone be able to get into the GoToWebinar console here. But can you just confirm that you can hear us now by just putting some in here to the questions box that you should see along your panel? Great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to wait one moment here before we start. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Planning for Digital Fragility in an Enterprise. My name is Erica, and I'm going to be your host today. So before I hand it over and introduce some of our speakers, I'm just going to go through a couple short items here. First of all, we are recording this event, and we'll be making it available to all participants, both registered and attending today, within the next 2 business days. Secondly, we'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but we do invite you to put those questions in during the presentation. You can put that in the questions box that is along that tree here when you opened up GoToWebinar. And I believe a number of you guys found that when we did the sound check here in a minute. So if there's no other questions, we're happy to have all of you guys here today. And I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers and go through our agenda. So we have 3 speakers here today. I'm very excited to hear from all of them. So first of all, we have Cheryl McKinnon from Forrester, and we'll be hearing from her first, followed by Ann Archer from BT, and then Michael Hope from here at Preservica. And what they will be talking about for the agenda here is we'll start off with Cheryl speaking about the impact of digital fragility. She'll be going over the report that she recently released, I believe it was in last December here, called Digital Fragility, the Ticking Time Bomb Within Enterprises. We do have a complimentary copy available of this report on the Preservica website, and we'll be referencing back to that and giving you a link to that report towards the end of this presentation. Then we're going to go into a real-life example here with Anne, talking about how digital fragility is addressed at BT. We'll follow that up with some of the capturing and preservation of critical digital assets with Michael, and talking about some of the additional resources, such as how to find the white paper that I just outlined here, and then going into Q&A. So with that, I'm just going to get started here, and I will hand this over to Cheryl. Try to get the slide forward there. There we go.
Great. Thank you very much. And again, it's an honor to be here on the session here today. Looking forward to the interaction. So as mentioned, my name is Cheryl McKinnon. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester Research. Over the last over 7 years that I've been with Forrester, I've been covering a fairly large segment of the overall content management, retention management, collaboration markets here. And this is a topic that, really kind of sits close to my heart, coming from a background not just in technology, but also as an historian. And I think it is a topic that is kind of sitting under the radar in a lot of organizations. And, I think we're reaching a time now where, as so many of us have shifted to a much more digital first way of working, so much of our corporate, our public sector, our culture, even personal artifacts are born digital today. It is an issue, I think, that is starting to pop up on many organizations' radar as a risk that needs to be understood, called out, and ultimately addressed in some capacity. So what we'll take a look at over the next few minutes is just an understanding of, what do we mean by this concept of digital fragility? We'll talk about some of the new business imperatives. That means we need to be aware of some of these new risks of being a digital first way of working. We'll talk about some of the benefits of protecting your brand as well as corporate memory, and then I'll wrap up with a few recommendations before turning the floor over to Anne. Digital fragility is real today. This is not just something that we can expect our predecessors, our future replacements in the workforce to worry about. This is something that we see essentially ripped from the headlines nearly every month. I like collecting some of these stories to really make this true. So whether it's cloud services that are discontinuing particular lines of business and even using their technologies to remove digital assets we may have subscribed to or licensed, whether it's the loss of older file formats that still lurk in many of our content management or network drive storage areas, whether it's our cultural books or groups that are being removed. I've just got a bit of a freeze here on my screen. There we go. Whether it's link rot, a topic that I think also lurks in so much of our corporate information, meaning that the URLs that we embed in our corporate reports, our research, our slide decks often dissolve or disappear over time. Shutdown of particular online services that we may have started to rely on. Alternative services that we need to subscribe to in order to get our pictures, for example, that we've been collecting over the course of a number of years. What I've also started to call regime change in terms of changes, whether it's in government, in political leadership, or even in corporate, when there's major mergers and acquisitions and suddenly information on the website disappears. And finally, we've been hearing this term over the last several weeks about living through this unprecedented time. What does the new normal look like? And we're really wondering, how are we capturing some of the decisions that we're making, in this moment of crisis? How are we going to remember how our company functioned and the decisions that we made? Are we thinking down the road in terms of learning from this moment of crisis? So there's a lot of real world challenges facing us here today. When we looked at this topic just towards the end of 2019, and as we continue to research into 2020, we did want to call out some of the key areas of risk that are now have appeared inside enterprise. Some of the more common areas that we see is this whole risk of file format obsolescence. Now that we're entering, often the third, if not fourth decade of digital work, we're starting to uncover collections of digital documents that were created in some of those early generation applications. And maybe we don't have the right tools to be able to open and use them effectively anymore. Or those particular vendors or applications have disappeared from the market. How are we able to retrieve and use that information and even modernize it if we want to be able to keep it going forward? Storage degradation is also an issue that we've seen started to come up. The vision that we had a number of years ago, decades ago, is CDs, DVDs, other forms of digital storage came into the market. Would this device last 100 years? Well, no, maybe it's going to last 20. We've again started to see some real world stories of even content created in this century no longer being available because of poor storage conditions leading to premature degradation of CDs, DVDs, USB, other forms of tape or other storage media. Link rot, as I mentioned, this is something that's really started to become a priority in terms of research for me. There's been some academic research that shows that if you look at scientific journals, US Supreme Court decisions, other legal medical journals, typically about a third of the links, those URLs that link back to government data, to other academic research, to news articles, those links often are gone within just a few years, or the content has been significantly updated where no longer is that reference a useful link or supporting piece of data. And that happens even internally if we are using embedded documents, if we're using complex spreadsheets, for example, that link back to other external sources or workbooks. If we move it, if we change it, is that risking breaking some of those links with our internal documents, not just with the web content? Vendor abandonment is one area that, if we look at some of those ripped from the headline screenshots from the previous slide, a lot of those are what we're starting to see. So when vendors choose to move out of a line of business, they no longer deemed to be core. Or if they're moving away from a free service in favor of a paid subscription service, what happens to those collected artifacts, to all of that information that users, consumers, businesses have been uploading, thinking it was a safe place to store their content, whether it's photos, whether it's their blogs, other forms of information. And then again, more recently, what happens when there's changes at the top, whether it's in political institutions, government, corporate mergers and acquisitions, when suddenly information about products, data, research disappears. Another risk that we see is that there's actually two kind of competing and often contradictory forces that we see inside of enterprises. The first is so many of us are measured on goals that are relatively short-term in nature, meaning, what's the readership on this content, monthly, annually, quarterly, perhaps. The digital artifacts we use to communicate with our customers, with our partners or suppliers. How effective is it in terms of getting readership? How much can we produce in a particular time period? Yet, on the other hand, we know that a lot of vital content is born digital, and it's got a long-term life cycle that may go beyond that particular campaign or program or project. It does have some bigger picture meaning that's going to have a life, produce some evidence, be a piece of information that's going to help us defend a program or a lawsuit down the road. But that information, if it's born digital, does have a high risk of falling out of context, losing the information around it, the metadata perhaps, information about the project or program it was intended to support. It may lose some of its characteristics because of things like format or storage degradation. And it may lose its value, it may lose its meaning over time. There's no people around to understand where it came from, why it was produced. So we have that kind of competing force there in terms of short-term motivation on behalf of a lot of content creators and producers, with the ability for that content to have a lifespan beyond the scope of that project or initiative. So let's talk about some of the imperatives that we're seeing in the market. One of the things that we look at Forrester is, what are the motivations behind business decisions, both from a technology as well as a business perspective. And when we survey some of our, very large user sets and look at some of the trends, we know that organizations want to invest in those programs and those technologies that help drive their customer experience, their revenue growth, their ability to respond quickly to changing market conditions. They want to be nimble and agile, because we are seeing that business models are evolving, and we see this firsthand. So with so many of us now, rapidly moving into work from home or remote work scenarios with literally just a couple days notice in many cases. We do see that business models are shifting from very kind of classic linear approaches, where you have some kind of input that goes in one door, some kind of product that goes out at the end of the process, to business models that are much more modular, nimble, flexible. We may have a project that is run by a consortium, perhaps a group of related companies, for just a couple of years. We may have subject matter experts, perhaps researchers, scientists, engineers coming in for a 5-year initiative, and then they're gone. So that whole concept of this fluid business model means we really need to think through the long-term implications of the intellectual property that we're producing, of the digital assets that support those go-to-market activities, those key corporate decisions in terms of who owns the IP, contracts, agreements, other forms of vital records. So we really need to make sure that we're thinking long-term, even as our business models become much more flexible, agile, and responsive to more short-term business conditions. So if we think about some of these new demands, these new use cases, we do need to think about some new approaches. When organizations I speak with talk about their digital business initiatives, they are relying on content, on the processes around that content, on opportunities for automation and also collaboration. We see so many organizations now pushing their digital content through what I've been calling their extended enterprise, meaning they want to engage with their customers, their suppliers, their law firms, those high-end design agencies that help them with their branding efforts. They want to be able to work with them digital first and collaboratively. So we need to kind of look at how do we embrace this extended enterprise and manage some of those expensive and high-value digital assets. We do see that in the broader market, there's a lot of innovation happening in the content and collaboration market. So we need to make sure that we're keeping pace with some of those modern, often cloud-first architectures. We know that overall, we need to balance our shift to this much more digital-first collaborative way of working with the growing landscape around privacy, security requirements, the compliance and governance needs. Those are not going away. And in fact, in many jurisdictions, they're getting more demanding. How do I protect that information? How do I make sure it's there in case there's a dispute 10 years down the road on this joint effort? So as our digital footprint accelerates, even more so today in times of crisis, and this rapid shift to much more remote and mobile work styles, we do need to think about that long-term capture of content and the protection of it. So let's talk about some of these risks inside the enterprise. This term digital fragility, we've been talking about that for about a year now, and it simply means that we're thinking about the areas where the degradation of data and storage, the reliance on ephemeral insights, broken links, abandonment of applications or sites by vendors. This is a growing risk to enterprise. So, in many cases, this is a single point of failure. And if our organization is not the one controlling things like archiving, backup, capture, then we do kind of imperil our ability to access this knowledge that's being generated in these digital forms. And if we think about even our ability to control content internally, we know that many of the systems that we use for kind of day-to-day or short to midterm content management, records retention, they may not be equipped to really handle those long-term requirements. If we think beyond the 15, 20-year mark, where we start getting into turnover in terms of the next generation of authoring applications, file formats begin to change, storage devices begin to evolve. So that's where we start to see the risk. Now, some of the data that we look at, one of the great things is we've been able to partner at Forrester with the industry association, the nonprofit professional organization, ARMA, for the last decade or so. And one of the questions we've been asking year over year to the records and information management profession is, just how confident are you that you're going to be able to retrieve your digital records in 15 years or more? And year over year, we typically have, an okay level of confidence. In fact, 42% in our last survey in fall 2019 expressed that they were confident about retrieval. Just 2% were very confident, which is interesting, and about 30% are neutral. So they're not entirely sure how accessible this older information actually might be. But what's interesting is that when we asked a follow-up question for the first time this year, just 60% actually have no long-term strategy for ensuring that those digital records are going to be accessible. So that, those 40% or so that are confident that they can open those records, they can use them, retrieve them, aren't necessarily actually planning to ensure that they're going to be available. So when we ask the question, do you have a specific digital preservation strategy for digital records with a long-term retention requirement, only 37% said yes. They were thinking beyond the couple of decades mark. 60%, nearly, about 58%, actually had no firm plans in this area. So there is a bit of a disconnect here in terms of expectation that we can open our content and the planning to ensure that we actually can. So what are the reasons that we do need to be aware of some of these risks? The key areas here are brand protection, compliance with an ever-changing regulatory and legal landscape globally, discovery, and of course, knowledge management and that protection of corporate memory. Some of the areas that we found really interesting when we were doing the research on this topic was just how expensive it can get for large global organizations who aren't preserving the intellectual property or the digital assets or even things like sales figures and promotional materials related to their promotion of a particular product or service in key markets. We found a couple of instances where just in 2019, the European Union Intellectual Property Office ruled that a couple of organizations were losing the rights to some very well-known brand names and trademarks because they could not demonstrate sufficient proof that they were protecting, maintaining, and actively using these word marks and trademarks in particular jurisdictions. So that's a lot of money on the line there to not only defend the brand, but potential risk of future revenue if you lose that particular challenge. We've known for a long time now that litigation and e-discovery costs can be very expensive if they're not rapidly resolved and if there isn't a good mechanism by which to retrieve information, perhaps from a dispute that started over a contract that was signed 20 years ago. Quite possible when we're looking at long-term projects, long-term digital assets that need to be preserved. So if we take a look at the whole protection of against litigation, against extensive e-discovery requests, being able to go back to those assets into those archives, absolutely essential. We also know that this has a direct relationship to things like customer experience. So, when businesses are battling on the front page, over whether, again, it's a trademark, whether it is, who said what, those poor experiences can lead to negative brand perception and perhaps loss of market or loss of trust in a particular organization. And then, of course, when we look at organizations that invest a lot of time and money in research, development, science, pharmaceuticals, chemical companies, cosmetic companies, there's a lot of importance here around protecting that digital intellectual property and all of the research and knowledge generation that comes out of those research activities. And then one that I'm sure many of us can relate to in any sector, just the wasted time and resources when work needs to be redone or those assets need to be redesigned or rebuilt because we can't find what we need. So some of the benefits of protecting brand and corporate memory. First off, and I think you'll hear some great examples in just a few moments from BT, but the ability to leverage your company brand, its heritage, its longevity, its perception of trust in the market can be used to drive both customer as well as your own internal experiences, especially in, again, times of crisis like this. Brands and companies that are serving their communities, offering promotions, doing good work. You want to be able to preserve that and show how your organization stepped up to help its consumers and the citizens in its particular jurisdictions. But also, can you expand on that and cultivate your own internal culture, your standards, your practices, your ethics? How is that company doing businesses? And how do you make sure the employees buy into that vision of how to do good business? Companies that have a strong protection of their intellectual property, again, there's areas where you can build that trust and shield against competitive threat because you do have that digital footprint, that public face in the market, and you're able to prove that you've been doing so over the years. And we do see that companies that have a proactive and thoughtful governance of their digital information, that's just one added leg to that stool of business resiliency and ongoing continuity. It means we respect our digital information, we know we can get to it when we need it, and it's going to help us move forward in any time of crisis. When we think about the stakeholders for the information that we're holding and producing and we need to be able to retrieve, we also know that there's stakeholders that reside both internally and externally. when we think about our information governance programs, of course, we always think about what does our legal team demand that we do? What do our records information management professionals ask us to do? What do the key lines of businesses need to help them make better decisions? But then increasingly, we do have those external stakeholders like our customers, especially with the rise of data protection and privacy laws, where they do have a stake in how we protect, maintain, and potentially dispose of and secure that particular information. So just a few final comments here in terms of recommendations. Where can you start looking today? One area I would recommend is, understanding your organizations or your departments. Where do you kind of sit in that digital maturity curve? We tend to see that there's 3 basic categories of digital maturity. A lot of customers I'm talking to tend to sit in between that beginner and intermediate phase. So when we think about organizations at that early stage, beginner, they're often looking at implementing technology or tools to kind of bolt on to existing manual or traditional practices. So they may be looking at opportunities to start test driving some innovation, looking for areas that are easier perhaps to automate and bring a digital first way of thinking into a particular process. Companies that have transformed some of those manual processes successfully then move into that second phase, the intermediate. So where can these digital leaders start building more of a customer first point of view, looking at opportunities to collaborate better internally and externally, and really focusing on what's going to help drive those top business imperatives: customer experience, revenue growth, competitive edge. There's that rare number of businesses that actually sit in that advanced stage, and these are often the disruptors in their own particular markets. They may be newer companies that are coming in from a digital first point of view, or they may actually be born digital. But most of us tend to sit between that beginner and intermediate stage today. The other thing that I think is really important is, thinking through what to preserve and how to be strategic about this. This is not a call to keep everything forever. This is not a call to throw away your existing records management policies and practices. It's about really thinking through, what are those artifacts that are going to endure? What has that, the ability to reflect how your company made decisions? How did it present itself to the outside world? What are some of those key areas of intellectual property, secret sauce that really differentiates your organization? And how do you make sure that it's being protected, preserved for the long haul, regardless of the applications or regardless of the formats or even the underlying content management systems that may have generated them? The other key thing is to really put this concept on somebody's watch list. This is not a call for perfection on day one. Starting to think about this today, putting some of those capture practices in place, starting to interview the teams that generate and create some of these key enduring assets is a good first step. Often this is a role that needs to sit outside of the CMO or the CIO. While the CMO may be ultimately responsible for the company brand, a lot of those key digital assets that define who we are, the job tenure of these roles tend to be 3 to 5 years. So we can't just keep kicking this problem down the road, hoping our predecessor is going to, or whoever comes after us is going to be able to fix it. We need to start thinking now, put it on someone's to-do list. Think about the most essential data and the content types and where the preservation actions can start early in the life cycle. Think about all the different kinds of digital assets, those artifacts, including things like source code, custom applications that you may build in-house, ephemeral data that may drive decisions. So perhaps the output of a report or some kind of analytics where you see the pattern and you make a decision. Are you able to capture that in that moment so you know why years down the road? Think about the importance of standards when you're looking at long-term accessibility and usability. There are some great standards that are well adopted, especially for things like textual documents with archival-ready formats that are often industry accepted. Looking at storage formats that are designed for long-term durability. And use your own regulatory legal compliance obligations as a starting point, but look deeper and broader. It's not enough to just meet the minimum threshold for keeping things as long as you need to, getting rid of things when they're obsolete. Think about the long-term strategy of your company and what are those assets and artifacts that you want to make sure endure with it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anne.
Okay, hello. So I'm really pleased to be here talking to you today about digital fragility from the case study of BT Archives perspective. I'm an archivist. I work for BT. I've had jobs in business archives before, so Lloyd's Banking Group, and before that, the British Museum. So today, I would just like to talk to you about digital fragility and how we planned within the archive of a large business and how we advocated and made the case for the importance of capturing and preserving digital material of long-term value. So how we procured a repository for ourselves. So BT is a global communications company. It has 100,000 employees and it has a very long heritage. Its heritage goes back to 1846, and that's with the foundation of the Electric Telegraph Company. And the telegraph was so popular that there were a large number of different companies that were formed, and then eventually the post office took over the provision of those services by about 1870. It was a similar story with the telephone. So the telephone was invented in 1876, and then in 1878 the first company was founded in the UK. There were a number of other telephone companies, and then again the post office took out a monopoly provision over them. So from 1912 until 1984, the post office was offering the vast majority of telecommunications services in the UK. And it was in 1984 that the telecom section of the post office was privatized and became BT. So it's a very rich heritage. And I suppose some of the legacies that come out of that is that we have been and continue to be part of national infrastructure, so communications infrastructure, and innovations. So we've always been involved in creating new innovations, and that is something that continues today. So in terms of the Heritage and Archives team and what we do within BT, our mission is to capture, to protect, to preserve, and to promote the long-term heritage assets of BT as a company. And we use those in support of the business and in support of wider customers and the community. And we describe the collection as the corporate memory. So it's those records that have long-term historical value and have been defined as such. So just a few examples of the type of material that we hold. We have strategic decision-making records, so things like project files or minutes. We also have records about innovations. So the photograph on the left is the electrophone, which was the late 1800s development, where you could listen to live music and theatre broadcasts down the telephone lines if you couldn't be there in person, which seems like quite a relevant example today. We also have a huge collection of research reports and memoranda and research designs. So on the right you can see this is a telegraph key from 1858. A huge collection of advertising material across the decades, and also a big phone book collection. So this on the right is the first telephone directory from 1880. It was only 6 pages long, and it has no telephone numbers because you would go straight to the operator and then be connected directly to the person that you wanted. Interestingly, telephone books kind of peaked in size around the 1990s. And then after the mobile phone really took hold, they're getting smaller and smaller each year. We still receive paper copies, but they are now quite thin. So that's just a brief outline of our collection. But to talk about digital fragility and what that means for us, and the way that we've described it to others as well, is to take them into our strong room where we store our physical collection. And for you, this is our virtual strong room, and actually for us, it's quite virtual at the moment because we can't be there in person. But if you were to come into our strong room, which is based in central London, and we have 3.5 kilometres worth of shelving if you put that end to end, as you walk in, you'd notice the temperature drop, it's humidity controlled, you'd have been through a number of levels of security in order to get in. So we're managing the collection properly, as you would expect. And then if we were to walk over to this plan chest and open the top drawer, you would see that there are 2 patents. They date from 1837, and they approved the invention of the electric telegraph, the first practical use of the electric telegraph. And it was from those that the first company would be founded. So they're very significant documents for us. And because they've been looked after reasonably throughout their life, and now that we've identified them as having this long-term historical value, we've packaged them properly, we've conserved them, we're storing them in the right conditions. So as far as we can be sure that they will last for the very long term. We've also taken professional photographs of them so that they can be used remotely by others, or if we don't want to retrieve the original. So if we walk a bit further into the strong room, you'd find this collection of cine film reels from the 1930s onwards. And this is a collection of different advertising films, training material. So it's part of the collection, and it was the way that we stored that particular media at that time. You'd also find VHS from the 1980s with similar content, and then records, so kind of strategic records, maybe held on floppy disks. So our collection also includes this kind of material. And the thing about this is, even though we can preserve it as best we can, that kind of material is degrading, and it will continue to degrade. And so we need to migrate it, keep the originals, but also migrate it into some kind of digital format so that we can continue to use that material. It's a bit harder to imagine, but if I were to take you into our digital storage area, what you'd find within that then is the photograph of the patent that I mentioned, also a wealth of other digitized content, so material that we've scanned in order to make it available online, because we have online platforms for making our content available. And then you'd find those outputs from those digital migration projects, so the contents of the cine and the VHS. But in addition to that, and the large bulk of our collection really is the digital native content, so the content that has always been digital in format. These are the records that BT are producing, and these are the records that we've identified as having that long-term historical value, and so we need to look after them for the long term. And I think, you know, a misconception is that digital lasts forever, that once we've stored it, that's all we need to do. But like our patent, now we have decided that this needs to be permanently preserved as part of our historical collection, then it needs active preservation measures, because digital is fragile. I think there are more risks to it than paper. We need to think about the platforms and storage. Are they being backed up? Are they being replicated? File formats might become unreadable. There's software and hardware that changes. So there's a lot to consider. And what it needs, and what we needed, was a purpose-built system so that can manage long-term preservation, not a digital asset management system, not a traditional archiving system. And if we take a step back from that further as well, being part of a large organization and the archive within that, we also need to identify and capture that material in the first place. So we need to be able to go out to the business and find those records that fit our criteria. And BT, along with all other large organizations, is producing huge volumes of data. And as it should be, it's adhering to retention periods, and things like data protection have really increased that. But that means that the urgency in which we need to make sure we identify and find it is increasing. The way we collect is also changing. So content's becoming more dynamic. Platforms and applications are being used a lot more to store content, so held in lots of different areas. And whilst we want to and need to feed into our data governance and records management programs and use automation, so e-discovery systems, I do think also as content collectors, we do still need to go out proactively to the business and try to collect that content. And to give one example, that Cheryl also mentioned, COVID-19. So I mean, this is really the immediacy of the crisis and the way we have to deal with it too, and think about how we capture the business response has really got archivists thinking. So from our perspective, what we've done so far is we've contacted the governance teams, so those that are the kind of COBRA equivalent, the emergency response teams, to let them know that we will want their records and that these records are important. But in addition to that, we need to think about how we can capture in detail what was done. So BT, as an example, is responsible for the 999 service. It created infrastructure as part of the Nightingale hospitals, which were the hospitals built for the pandemic. And in its research labs, it's been building 3D printing face masks for the NHS. So these are exceptional times, and they also require exceptional responses in order to find and understand what's being produced. In addition to the strategic side, we've also thought about how we can capture the memories and the experiences of people. So internal communications are a great place to start with that. And for us, that will probably lead to us having to archive material from places like Workplace by Facebook, areas we've never had to archive content before. So again, that dynamic content. And being an archivist, I can refer to and I can mine information from our collection in order to inform how we're thinking about this. So this is a publication from 1978, or part of a publication that was produced to commemorate an event. So a telephone exchange exploded, was razed to the ground. Luckily, no one was hurt. But clearly, this was an unprecedented event in the life of the telephone operators, the telephone engineers. And so they put together a series of interviews and memory capture, poems, press cuttings, and they combined it into this publication. So that's something we've been able to share with internal communications, and we're thinking about doing a similar publication when things have settled down a bit. And in terms of advocacy and making the case within an organization, so again, this is from our perspective, and what we were trying to do was to raise awareness and to get a suitable solution that we could use to preserve our digital assets, because we knew that was an issue. And the way that we did that is there were three elements really. So I think the first is to just know your topic completely. So that's, first of all, how does digital fragility look within your own organization or your own area? And I've described ours, but everybody's would be slightly different. Digital preservation risks and issues. If you have to try and persuade others that it's a big issue, it'd be really important to know the topic very well. And so there's lots of resources out there. This report, there's the Digital Preservation Coalition, and other organizations that look at advocacy in this area. There's training. So we used a lot of those. And then organizational alignment. I think if you can look at what your company is interested in at the moment, investing in, its risk appetite, then you can try and align what you're doing to your organization. The second one is the communication part. So once you have all of this information, it's trying to find the right people. So I think that's the people who will be able to support you best in what you're trying to do, and also those people that get it, because they'll be your biggest champions. And then your key messages. So understanding, and again referring back to Cheryl's slide about once you know you have this content you want to preserve for the long term, it needs a different solution to the content that you're managing for the short term, and it's understanding that and being able to sell that. And then also trying different channels. So for us, that was risk and IT, data governance. And again, the records management area is very important because in addition to hopefully helping you with the preservation side, they can help with the capture and identification of material. And then if it's possible, you can start small. So preservation measures, I think, are within reach, even without funding. So you can look at what file formats you have. You can think about metadata capture. You can, there's various other things that you can do. And also, if you can get some funding, a small amount of funding, it's possible to start a feasibility or a proof of concept. And that helps to drive the momentum, and it will also get you a business case that's written in the language that your business understands, which can be very helpful. Finally, I think for us, we did create a financial case, and that's very, very difficult for archives or those areas where the value you're creating might be quite intangible, but it's possible to do it based on cost avoidance. So if there's any examples within the organization of how costs have been avoided through having evidence or having that protection of information, whether that be paper or digital, it's still relevant, because if you don't have that information in a digital format in the future, then you may attract those kind of costs. So you might be able to do something around that. And then finally, on the benefit side, so just to flip that, first of all, in terms of the risks of not doing that, for us would entail a gap in the corporate memory that wouldn't be able to be filled. So that would be have a big impact. So it could have reputational impact, financial, because we wouldn't have that protection or that evidence. Operationally, we wouldn't have access to that knowledge. We wouldn't have access to our story. It couldn't be used for different innovations and inspiration. But to focus on the benefits, for us, I think I can't really separate the digital and the physical records in this case, because actually the benefits that digital bring are the same as the benefits that the archive as a whole can bring to the organization. And that is, internally, it can be, again, that protection side of things, evidence. It can be used for knowledge. It can inspire and create pride amongst your staff. And then externally, it can be used for engagement, to promote trust. So you've always been doing this, you have a long heritage of doing this. And then differentiation, because no other company has a heritage like your company. And just to give a couple of examples from our side of the benefits, and I can't really talk about the kind of legal and evidential benefits because they're more internal, but externally, we did quite recently we were involved in a collaboration with Central St Martin's School of Art and Design, and got involved in a national festival where the students from the art school created responses to our archives, both physical and digital. And you can see one on the left here, which was a response to a photograph of wiring, and the student created an installation. And we had different audiences that came to see these responses that were external. But we also had an internal film that was produced to be shown to BT people. So it was an interesting example of external interest and external stakeholders kind of driving internal appreciation and value for the collection. And the second one is BT Shop, which is BT's e-commerce arm, and it sells things like smart products, such as Alexa, Google Assistant, smart speakers, tablets, broadband, etc. And they created a history microsite in collaboration with us. And the reason they did that is they wanted to create a kind of soft sell. So it wasn't supposed to be a hard sell for customers, but they wanted to make links between current products and historical products, which was completely possible because often innovations, the seeds of them are older than you might think. So for example, the nice 80s film on the right-hand side you can see the still of, was a film about the mobile phone in the early days, but how they perceived that it might develop in the next 20 years. And it was quite accurate. There were things like you could control the lights in your home and the heating in your home via your mobile phone, which very much relates to kind of smart home products today. So just to conclude then, often the value of heritage assets to an organisation are not tangible and they can't necessarily be expressed on the balance sheet, but they do add value in many different ways and they differentiate the business from its competitors. And by ensuring the survival of these key digital materials, we're ensuring that the organisation remembers and that it can share its achievements, its innovation, and the way that it's weathered different storms in the past and continues to do so, and that it can do that for the long term. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody. Just waiting to move the slides. Here we are. Hi everybody, and thank you very much to Cheryl, and thank you to Anne. Some really amazing and interesting points, which I'll come back to in a second. But before that, I'll just do a very brief overview of Preservica for those of you not familiar with us. We are market leaders in cloud archiving and active digital preservation, with a platform that's been designed from the ground up to address the various challenges we're talking about here of digital fragility. Preservica started as a digital preservation project at the UK National Archives over a decade ago, and we've now grown to have over 250 customers worldwide. Here's just a few of those customers. So you can see BT up there in the top left-hand corner, but we have organizations right across the globe using Preservica in many different sectors, including government, education, national and pan-national, and a significant and growing number of corporate and business archives, both in the US and in the UK as well. So just picking up on some of the points that Cheryl and Anne raised, we're also seeing a rising awareness of digital fragility, particularly at this time. In fact, we've got 50 customers currently participating in an initiative that we're calling Our COVID-19 Story, and they're sharing some incredible work that they're doing right now to actively capture and preserve digital records of these unprecedented times. And that includes, government websites, policy records, to video testimonials. One thing that they're all telling us is that the volume and dependency on digital content, as we've heard, has dramatically increased, and that includes everything that Anne was talking about in terms of governance, internal and external communications that are happening at this time, new innovations, new manufacturing lines opening up, a repositioning of brands and marketing campaigns, as well as community and employee outreach programs. So this, all of this content is being created today, and it's going to be crucial to informing the brand and decision making in the future. So as Cheryl was saying, your organization can stand behind what it did to support the crisis at this time. So I think there's a real need, but also a real opportunity here for you to step forward right now to highlight to your stakeholders what could be lost if you don't have an easy way to capture and preserve this material. So as Anne was saying, there's a real opportunity to reach out to stakeholders across your organization, whether they are in in legal, in innovation, in corporate comms, or the corporate secretary, and get support and build your case for having an active preservation repository which can look after this digital information for you. So how can Preservica help? Well, we have an active preservation platform, which will protect all types of digital content from digitized and born digital records. They can be easily captured, actively preserved so that they can be found, instantly rendered in contemporary applications, decades into the future, and all of that in line with any compliance or retention policies you have in place. This also includes automatic archiving of websites, as well as automatic archiving of common content management platforms to make that capture so much more effective. And of course, because it's all cloud hosted, it enables online collaboration, remote working, and secure sharing of digital content with internal and external communities. So just to finish up, there's various resources, as Erica said. We'll send a copy of the slides, and you can link through to these, and that includes a complimentary copy, if you haven't got a copy already, of the original Forrester research, which Cheryl wrote, and also features Anne from BT, as well as several other Pacifica customers. So with that, I'll hand back over to Erica for questions.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to Cheryl and Anne for their presentation. So just again, if you have any questions, please put them into the question box here. I see that we have a few. I think we have a couple minutes here to just take some of these questions. So first of all, I think I have a question here for both Cheryl and Anne. I think we covered some, but if you don't mind going through some of this in more detail. But we had a question, someone that said, I think this is a topic that is important, but not many of my others in my company even think this is a problem. How can I stir some urgency within my company to start looking at some of this digital preservation?
Yeah, this is Cheryl. Yeah, that is a really interesting one, because I know that when I'm talking to customers, even if the topic is related to records retention, content management, that long-term thinking is often oh, I hadn't really considered that. I often advise to look at the opportunities, where are there hotspots of either high risk or high reward? And so that might mean, going into legal compliance teams, where has there been, a struggle or a particularly expensive or time-consuming discovery requirement that had to go back into older records that perhaps were inconsistently categorized, or people didn't remember where they might be stored, or what team may have originated some of that stuff. So I'd probably look at some of the kind of the hot spots in terms of where there's opportunities for quick wins, both to cost avoidance, risk reduction, but again, maybe appealing to kind of that sense of corporate memory and the brand power that an organization wants to be able to have that legacy in terms of how are they serving their customers and what face are they presenting to the world. So maybe a risk area, but also a reward area, such as brand or asset or corporate marketing.
Great.
Yeah,
do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, real examples are great where we can find them. I think as well, I might look externally. We found it useful to benchmark against other companies and other organizations, because a lot of organizations are not just thinking about this, but they are doing something about it. So having those examples, having access to reports or external bodies, I think that can all kind of add some weight to what you're trying to do. As well, if there are other areas within the business that might be interested in this, or might actually already have material that requires long-term preservation, then perhaps getting them on board and working together might also drive some urgency. But I think sometimes if it's not possible to drive that sense of urgency, is not to be disheartened, because this is important. So it is important to keep going and sort of plug away at it, and gradually the momentum will come.
That sounds great. Thank you very much for both of them. And I think we do have a few more questions, but I just want to be conscious of time here, that we're at the top of the hour. So if we weren't able to answer your questions today, we will have someone follow up. and see if we can help you with some of those answers. And I'm just going to send you here before we leave. So we do have some additional information if you'd like to contact us here at Preservica. Please feel free to email us at info@preservica.com or go to preservica.com and fill out the Contact Us form. You can also follow us at Preservica or at dpreservation on Twitter. Finally, we do ask that there is a quick survey after this. We want to make sure that we're continuing to bring you content like this and that we're matching what you need and what can help you in your organization. So we ask that you fill that out so we can continue to do these type of programs. And with that, I would like to send, a big thank you to both Cheryl and Anne and Michael for putting this content together. And thank you for everyone for attending. And we hope to see you at some future presentations such as these.